said to you and Tyler, I'm not saying they have lied, and I'm not saying they haven't lied. I don't know. I have no reason to disbelieve your clients or to believe them. Just because somebody tells you the sky is blue does not mean the sky is blue. You do know that, right?
Well, I can tell you this: they were off Horn Island at 4:30 p.m. on July 4th, and Nolan Wells was seen alive.
Now we're getting somewhere. How can you prove that to me other than them telling you?
The friends are on a PR, PR blitz to change public opinion because they believe that they, in the court of public opinion, they're not doing so well, that they have been, sort of demeaned in some way, disparaged in some way.
I think it's weird. I think it's weird.
Yeah.
When Warren sat down with the guy, I know we don't like to say his name, sat down with him, I was like, okay, this one kid and his mom is a judge, and maybe he wants to sort of clear his name. But now every week, another friend sits down, and another friend sits down, and and now they've got this lawyer, and they're sitting down and doing interviews. It's weird to me. And it's not just weird. There are people who are going to say things on the internet. Why does that rise to the level of you need an attorney to now sit down and do interviews to publicize yourself, to try and change the court of public opinion? Why do you care about a court of public opinion? Because you didn't do anything. And ultimately, if you didn't do anything, and maybe they didn't, let's take them at their word and their attorney that they didn't have anything to do with Nolan's death. That's all going to come out when the results of the autopsy come out, when the investigation comes out. So why are you now it's almost like I get like this attorney has probably convinced them, yes, do this and talk about this and it'll change public opinion. But what it really does, it makes some people will look at it and go like, well, what are you getting out in front of?
But other than that, I feel like his mom blasting us on social media from the get-go, saying that he was out there with Warren and another guy. And then also the fact that she posted a picture of me and Morgan and another guy and Nolan on the boat together, blasting that out there, pushing this narrative, kind of, I guess.
Wait a minute. Let me get this straight. The mother is trying to find her son. She sends out a picture because you guys were together. Am I missing something? I'm confused. Y'all were together with him. He was on a boat with you guys. You're mad she put out the picture to the public?
Then as viral or gone all over the country at this point. I mean, this is a countrywide news story that is just blown out of proportion. And the fact that it was our best friend and it's not what people...
Something a lot of people are pointing out is Warren and how much his face has changed since just the first interview a few weeks ago to right now. And it begs the question, like, he looks like he has Ozempic face, in my opinion, but is something eating away at him? Now, obviously, this has to be very stressful, all of a sudden becoming this unwanted celebrity. He talks about where he went into a restaurant and was threatened and whatnot, but this doesn't look like weight loss by a man who lost his best friend and he just hasn't slept or hasn't eaten and is just doing everything he can to figure out what happened to his friend. It looks like something is literally eating away at his soul. That's all I'm saying. It's just my opinion. What do you guys think about it? Let me know in the comments.
Even TMZ seems to have stopped going along with it this week. For weeks, TMZ had been one of the most welcoming platforms this friend group could rely on. But this week, on air, a TMZ host called their constant stream of interviews strange, and raised a question a lot of people have apparently been asking privately. If you truly had nothing to do with it, what exactly are you trying to get ahead of? That shift happened the same week one of the friends, during an interview, criticized Nolan's own mother for making his photo public. We're going to play that section in full, because however you interpret it, hearing someone call Nolan a brother while also criticizing his mother makes for a genuinely uncomfortable moment. We're also taking a closer look at the central claim this entire defense has leaned on for weeks, that two witnesses reportedly saw Nolan alive on the island around 6 p.m., roughly 90 minutes after the friends say they had already left. Nancy Grace didn't simply accept that timeline. Instead, she raised exactly the kinds of questions a defense lawyer would have to answer in an actual courtroom. Tonight, we're breaking down 3 questions that still don't have clear answers. Who exactly are these witnesses? Were their accounts compared before they ever spoke with investigators? And does the photo being used to support this timeline even have a verifiable timestamp? We're also comparing the friend group's latest account with what they said earlier, because several details appear noticeably different. And we're not going to skip over those inconsistencies just because they're uncomfortable to discuss. These are the details that deserve serious attention tonight. Nothing more.
And Tyler, I'm not saying they have lied, and I'm not saying they haven't lied. I don't know. I have no reason to disbelieve your clients or to believe them. Just because somebody tells you the sky is blue does not mean the sky is blue. You do know that, right?
Well, I can tell you this: they were off Horn Island at 4:30 p.m. on July 4th, and Nolan Wells was seen alive.
Now we're getting somewhere. How can you prove that to me other than them telling you? I assume you've got GPS tracking and the call to Cito.
We have witnesses among other things, but I can also tell you this: they were off the island at 4:30 p.m. and Nolan Wells was seen alive by multiple people at 6 p.m. still on the island.
Tyler,
Yes.
the witnesses that came forward, here's something that would tend to corroborate them, is if multiple witnesses said the same thing. Witnesses separated in time and space, witnesses that are not all friends, witnesses that are not good friends with your clients, that may have a reason to be fuzzy on the time. I'm not saying they are, or that they're not. Here's my question to you. Are these witnesses friends of your clients?
I don't think they're friends, and they're not even the same age.
Okay. Next question. How many witnesses place him there on the island at 6-ish?
At least 2 that I know.
2. Do the witnesses know each other?
Yes.
Were they together that day?
Yes.
For weeks, this friend group's entire defense has rested on one very specific claim. 2 witnesses reportedly saw Nolan alive on Horn Island around 6 p.m., a full 90 minutes after the friends say they had already left. Their attorneys have called it, in their own words, 100% end of story. But Nancy Grace didn't simply accept that description, and neither should you, at least not until 3 major gaps are properly addressed. Gap 1. Who exactly are these witnesses? As of tonight, their identities still haven't been publicly revealed. The attorneys have offered a legitimate reason, and it's one that deserves to be taken seriously. They say the identities are being protected because they don't want these witnesses exposed to the same wave of threats that has already targeted Bart Edmiston's family, Trace's Tin Shepherd, and other people connected to this case. That's not some imaginary concern. Threats involving people tied to this investigation have been documented, confirmed, and are clearly serious. We're not going to pretend that shielding witnesses from harassment is some manufactured excuse. But here's where the issue gets complicated. Anonymity can protect a witness from public harassment. What it doesn't do is allow the public, or frankly anyone outside the friend group's own legal team, to independently examine the identification being presented on their behalf. When Nancy Grace pushed for some basic information, important questions immediately surfaced. Did these witnesses know Nolan well enough to confidently identify him? Could either of them have been drinking? And how did they determine the time was specifically 6 p.m. instead of 5:30 or 6:30? The attorney's answers repeatedly amounted to some version of, "I believe so," or "I'm not sure." An attorney speaking to the credibility of these witnesses should, at minimum, be able to say whether they'd been drinking that day. If that basic detail isn't known while the public is simultaneously being asked to treat the identification as completely reliable, That's a legitimate gap. Gap 2, and this may be the most important issue from an investigative standpoint. Were these witnesses together, and did they discuss what they saw before either of them spoke with investigators? Nancy Grace asked that question directly, and the response was fairly straightforward. Yes, the two witnesses know each other. Yes, they were together that day. Then came the more important question. Had they discussed their memories with one another before speaking to police? The attorney's answer, in his own words, was essentially, "I'm sure they did." That detail matters a great deal, and it's worth explaining why instead of simply labeling it suspicious. Eyewitness memory isn't a perfect recording stored inside someone's brain. It's reconstructive, and research has repeatedly shown that another person's version of an event can shape how someone remembers and describes their own experience. Two people who already know each other, spent the day together, and discussed what they believe they saw before either gave an official statement are no longer offering two fully independent pieces of information. Instead, you potentially have one shared recollection being repeated by two people. That's exactly why formal investigations typically question witnesses separately before they get a chance to compare notes. The same standard we've applied throughout this case should be applied consistently to every account, not selectively to one particular version. And the attorney's own admission that the witnesses probably talked about the event beforehand creates an important distinction. The two-witness claim could functionally be closer to a single account later echoed by a friend, rather than two completely independent eyewitness accounts confirming one another. Gap 3 involves the photo and video being used to support this timeline. Neither appears to have a publicly confirmed timestamp. When Nancy Grace specifically pressed on that issue, asking when the video showing who was on the boat was actually recorded, and whether it carried a verifiable timestamp, neither attorney gave a direct answer. One attorney responded that the question wasn't particularly relevant to him, since his side wasn't responsible for creating the video. That's a fair point when we're talking about who legally carries the burden of proving something. But it's a far less satisfying explanation when that exact footage is also being presented publicly as evidence for when the friends supposedly left the island. You can't really have it both ways. If a video is being presented as proof the clients had already left by a particular time, then the timestamp attached to it isn't some minor technical detail. It's central to the entire timeline being presented. Without a verified timestamp that doesn't simply rely on someone's personal recollection, the footage establishes that people were on a boat at some point. It doesn't automatically establish the exact time they were there. And to be fair to the other side, we've applied this same standard to every other claim throughout this case. None of these three gaps proves the 6 p.m. sighting is false. It's entirely possible that two people genuinely saw Nolan on the island at 6 p.m., later discussed what happened with each other, and are still telling the complete truth. When something frightening happens, people naturally talk about it with friends. Sharing a memory doesn't automatically make that memory unreliable. Sometimes discussing an event with someone you trust simply helps you put into words something you already remember clearly. Likewise, the absence of a publicly available timestamp doesn't necessarily mean investigators haven't privately confirmed one. Attorneys choosing not to reveal technical details during a television interview isn't proof those details don't exist elsewhere. So there's an important distinction here. This could be completely accurate, and this has been independently proven, are two very different standards. The attorney's 100% end of story language suggests the second standard, while what's actually been demonstrated publicly looks much closer to the first. Nancy Grace's closing point on this issue may be the fairest way to frame it. If these witnesses are telling the truth, then determining exactly who was the last person to see Nolan alive could matter more than almost anything else currently being debated online. And that holds true regardless of where that answer eventually leads. Verdict: the 6 p.m. witness claim is a genuine claim made by real attorneys and potentially backed by real witnesses. But as of tonight, it hasn't been independently established in the three specific areas that would make it courtroom solid rather than simply television confident: identity, independence, and timestamp. Until those three gaps are properly addressed, calling this end of story is premature in either direction. So the real question remains: which of these three gaps would you personally need answered before you considered the timeline settled?
The Nolan Wells case, let me tell you, as a former head county prosecutor and a former assistant prosecutor that did homicide work, where I think the prosecutor, Angel Myers McGrath, is making a huge mistake. So, look, everyone's going crazy here. I disagree with her approach to media relations and educating the public. Now, I get when she said that she was protecting the integrity of the investigation. I've done that myself, but I had very strong relationships with the minority community. And when we had police involved minority shootings, they were first people that I met with and gave me the distance and breathing room to conduct the investigation without any fanfare, people in front of the cameras, marching in the streets, etc. That obviously that trust has not been established in, from what I'm seeing in the comments and the millions of views that I'm getting on my videos, a great degree of distrust in Mississippi. And you have to address that as a public official. It's a very real thing. Whether it's truthful or not, you need to address it. So here's my thing. You're not compromising an investigation by getting up and combating misinformation in the public, number one. How many search warrants have been issued? I wrote a list here. What electronic data has been done? What communication data warrants have gone out? How many? I'm not asking you for what and what you're looking for, but just give us an idea of what you're doing that way. Have you gone to the courts for those search warrants? How many witness interviews have occurred? How many tips and leads have you received? Because I'm going to imagine it's been an amazing amount, and the public doesn't know that. You have to run all those leads down. What experts have been called in? Maybe what area? Is it forensics, toxicology, audio, video? These would all be important things. You're not giving away any information by telling the public what it is you're doing that way. How many photos and videos have you had to review? Because I imagine people are submitting stuff all over the place, and it takes a lot of time to go through that digital record, authenticate it, and see if there's anything of evidentiary value. How about satellite imagery or any other cooperating agencies? And who are they? That may be useful to know. Oh, you're really being serious. You're bringing in other law enforcement agencies. How many law enforcement assets are you have out there? How many people? How many man hours? You know, you need to do a press conference at the end of all this and lay it all out. While the grand jury is a secret proceeding, and I get that people aren't entitled to that because it protects the innocent, and that's what a grand jury is supposed to do and be secret, doesn't mean you can't do a press conference. I did it in high-profile, racially involved cases where I went out and said, here's a 2-hour press conference to tell you everything we did, how we did it, and why we came to the conclusions we came to. But well before that, Madam District Attorney, I would get out there and make sure you're with the community and letting the community leaders know so they can support you that you're doing the right thing. Right now, we're all out here and we just don't know. It looks like nothing's going on. I know that's not true. Correct the record. Like, share, and follow for more.
Tonight, we're going to apply that same standard to the friend group's own version of events, while also giving fair weight to an argument that pulls in the opposite direction. A fair analysis has to consider both sides. First, let's talk about the inconsistencies. How many phones were actually left behind on the boat? In the newest interview, the number given is oddly specific and relatively small. Nolan's phone, along with 5 other people's phones, were supposedly left on the boat. That's 6 phones total, including Nolan's. Earlier in this case, however, the number that circulated, including through accounts connected to the friend group that were repeated elsewhere, was closer to 15 phones left on the same dashboard. 15 and 6 are not remotely the same number. That's not a minor rounding issue. One account describes a boat holding more than twice the number of abandoned phones described in the newer telling. And neither figure has been independently confirmed by anyone outside the friend group. So the honest answer is that we don't know which number, if either, is actually correct. But both accounts can't be accurate at the same time. That's worth pointing out plainly, rather than picking whichever number happens to fit a theory someone already believes. Second inconsistency, and this one has more to do with how the events are described than the exact facts. Throughout this interview, Warren repeatedly uses language that downplays the situation involving the phone and keys. He describes it as if there was never really an issue. The keys were handed over. It supposedly took less than 30 seconds. No trouble at all. But set that description next to what the same interview actually says happened. There was a hostile phone call. Then somewhere between 10 and 15 people reportedly showed up at his house. Doors were being banged on, and people were searching a friend's boat. The confrontation grew serious enough for police to be called, with officers arriving around 2 o'clock in the morning to physically remove people from the property. Those two accounts are hard to square. A completely routine, uneventful exchange involving a phone and keys doesn't normally end with police arriving at 2 a.m. to break things up. So either the no-issue description significantly understates what happened, or some of the surrounding details got exaggerated as the story was retold. Both possibilities deserve consideration. We shouldn't automatically accept the calmer version simply because it's the one being delivered straight into a camera. Third inconsistency, and this may be the one that deserves the closest attention. Warren says more than once that he personally told Christine, during their very first phone conversation, that he had Nolan's phone. His account is essentially, "I told her, I said, yeah, he left it on the boat with us." If that's an accurate description of that first conversation, it raises an obvious question. Why did Christine still need to use Life 360 to physically locate the phone afterward? If Warren had already told her exactly where the device was and who had it, using a location tracking app seems like an unnecessary extra step. The most reasonable explanations may be less dramatic than some people assume. Perhaps the detail wasn't communicated clearly. Maybe it was forgotten, downplayed, or simply remembered differently by Warren when looking back on an extremely stressful night. That kind of imperfect recollection is completely possible. But the version being presented now, with such clarity, doesn't perfectly line up with the fact that a location tracking app was apparently still needed afterward. Now, here's the argument that pushes strongly in the other direction. And we're going to give it the same amount of attention we just gave the inconsistencies, because it deserves to be judged on its own merits. A commentator with 3 decades of experience as a homicide prosecutor, criminal defense attorney, and former head of a prosecutor's office offered 3 specific observations based on his professional background. This is someone who says he has personally presented thousands of cases before grand juries, so his perspective deserves to be examined rather than dismissed. First, despite this case already reaching the stage of a grand jury presentation, there has still been no arrest. If probable cause existed at a level sufficient to justify an arrest warrant, that could have happened before the grand jury presentation ever took place. It didn't. Second, as of tonight, there has been no public determination of homicide or foul play. According to the independent examiner's reported findings, there were no documented contusions, defensive injuries, fractures, or puncture wounds. Instead, there was one area of discoloration that could potentially have been caused by postmortem changes. Third, and this is perhaps the point that deserves the most consideration, these young men are still appearing publicly and giving interviews repeatedly, often with their attorneys present, months into an ongoing investigation. According to this prosecutor's professional experience, defense attorneys who believe their clients are genuine targets in a serious criminal investigation generally don't encourage them to keep giving public interviews. The typical advice when significant legal exposure exists is silence. So, in his professional assessment, the fact that these attorneys are continuing to allow repeated public appearances could be read as a meaningful sign of confidence from people who would presumably know what's happening behind the scenes. If their clients were facing immediate and serious legal danger, there would be strong professional reasons to stop the interviews. We have to hold both of these arguments honestly, instead of picking whichever one supports a conclusion we've already reached. The inconsistencies in the friend group's own retellings are real and deserve serious examination. There's the conflicting phone count. There's the no-issue description that's hard to reconcile with a confrontation involving police. And there's the claim that Warren already told Christine about the phone, which doesn't fully explain why Life 360 was apparently still needed to locate it. None of those issues has been invented. At the same time, the prosecutor's counterargument is also legitimate and comes from someone with substantial courtroom experience. No arrest, no public homicide finding, and continued public appearances by people whose attorneys would have every professional incentive to stop those appearances if they believed their clients were facing genuine legal danger. Those are all meaningful pieces of information. They simply point in different directions. And a fair viewer has to weigh both, instead of discarding whichever piece of evidence feels less convenient. The friend group's account contains genuine internal inconsistencies that remain unresolved. Separately, The actual procedural status of the investigation, no arrest, no public homicide determination, and continued attorney-approved public statements, represents exactly the type of situation a veteran prosecutor might read as reassuring. One reality doesn't cancel out the other. Both can exist at the same time. Where someone ultimately lands may depend on which set of facts they consider more significant. So which side actually shifts your view more? The inconsistencies in the friend group story, or the fact that they're continuing to speak publicly with their attorneys apparently allowing it?
The Coast Guard searched for him that night. Warren clung to that like it was a safety raft.
I think from the beginning, I'm glad that I called the Coast Guard. It would have been completely different. I'm glad I called the Coast Guard.
It's like, I'm sorry, Warren, but it's actually way more suspicious that you called the Coast Guard. Because first, you didn't want to call the Coast Guard when you guys were sinking. And then for some reason, you assumed that Nolan was still out on the island at 11 o'clock at night. Why wouldn't you assume that he came back with the person he was supposed to come back with and something happened to him in transit? Because no reasonable person would think that he was still out on the island, in my opinion. Because in your own words, Warren, you said you didn't talk to Katie till the next day. And then speaking of the island, the lawyer tries to say that by them going to the island and looking around, that it absolutely exonerates them and that the narrative couldn't be this, and ends it with a wild statement, mind you.
People who have been sucking up way more oxygen than they're entitled to have not been to the island. I'm willing to bet that a lot of the hustlers and profiteers and liars have not been to that island, and you have to go to that island. And being at the island today was revelatory. It was really illuminating. It's a very dynamic marine environment, first of all. But when you go to the island, you see instantly that what some people want to be true, what they wish to be true, they're trying to wish it to be true, they're trying to make it true through their lives. It's actually not possible. It is a very, very long and narrow barrier island. It's basically very low sand dunes. And the particular part of the island that we're dealing with, there are no trees. It's hardly any foliage, hardly any tree cover, hardly any plants, and it's wide open. And on July 4th, there were thousands of people there. There is no...
Warren has repeatedly described his call to the Coast Guard as one of the clearest signs that he genuinely cared about doing the right thing the moment he realized something might be wrong. I'm glad I called the Coast Guard, he has said more than once, presenting the call as evidence that he acted in good faith. But one commentator pushed back strongly against that interpretation this week, and the argument deserves to be examined carefully rather than dismissed simply because it complicates a sympathetic narrative. Here is the argument. Earlier that same day, when the boat itself was taking on water, Warren's group reportedly declined Coast Guard assistance when it was offered. Later that night, however, Warren personally contacted the Coast Guard, specifically about Nolan. On the surface, the two decisions can look inconsistent. The group turned down help when their own boat was having a problem, yet hours later they actively sought the Coast Guard's assistance for a friend they'd already said they believed had left with someone else. There's another part of the argument worth examining. If the group genuinely believed Nolan had planned to get a ride back with another person, the most logical first step after he failed to show up would seemingly have been to identify and contact that person. Instead, Warren contacted the Coast Guard, an agency specifically equipped for water searches and rescues. That could suggest Warren and the others were considering a different possibility, that Nolan might still be alone, stranded, or in danger somewhere near the water. Those are two very different concerns. The commentator argues that going straight to a Coast Guard search, rather than first confirming Nolan's supposed ride home, doesn't perfectly match the explanation the group gave for what they believed happened. There's another specific detail in Warren's account. Warren has said he did not actually speak with Katie, the person who could potentially confirm whether Nolan had left with her group, until the following day. That raises a reasonable question about the sequence of events. If contacting Katie was the most direct way to resolve the uncertainty, why did the Coast Guard become involved before that conversation took place? But there's also an important counterargument, and this context changes how the situation can be read. According to the account provided, Warren did not have Katie's phone number that night. Her contact information was reportedly obtained the following day through mutual friends, after the group began trying to figure out where Nolan might have gone. If that's accurate, then the question of why Warren didn't simply call Katie first assumes he had immediate access to her contact information, which he may not have. There's also a significant difference between the two Coast Guard decisions. Declining assistance earlier that afternoon happened while a private tow was already underway. The boat was still afloat, there was a clear mechanical explanation for the problem, and people were physically present and handling the situation. The Coast Guard call later that night happened under very different circumstances. Hours had passed without clear contact from Nolan. There was no confirmed information about where he actually was, and darkness was falling over a remote barrier island accessible only by water. Those situations involve very different levels of uncertainty. One was a mechanical problem already being managed, with help apparently on the way. The other involved a person whose whereabouts were unknown at night in an area surrounded by open water. That's precisely the type of situation where Coast Guard search and rescue resources can become important. So calling the Coast Guard that night doesn't necessarily contradict the earlier decision to decline their assistance. In fact, depending on the circumstances, it could be viewed as the appropriate call once the situation shifted from a manageable mechanical issue into an unresolved missing person concern. The same logic applies to the question of whether Nolan might have been traveling with someone else. It's entirely possible for someone to believe Nolan probably found another ride while still worrying that assumption could be wrong. Those two possibilities don't have to be mutually exclusive. A worried friend can hope someone made it home safely while also recognizing that hope isn't confirmation. And if that assumption turned out to be wrong, the worst-case scenario would involve exactly the kind of environment where Coast Guard assistance could become critical: open water, darkness, limited communication, and a remote location. Calling the Coast Guard under those circumstances doesn't automatically prove Warren secretly knew something was wrong. It can just as easily be read as an attempt to err on the side of caution after several hours had passed without reliable information. So the sequencing is genuinely worth questioning. Why did the Coast Guard get involved before Warren was able to speak directly with Katie? That's a fair question. However, the apparent contradiction between declining Coast Guard assistance for the boat earlier in the day and requesting it for Nolan later that night becomes less convincing once the two situations are examined separately. One involved a mechanical emergency that was already being handled. The other involved a person whose whereabouts were uncertain in an open water environment after dark. Those aren't necessarily comparable decisions, and treating them as identical may overstate the inconsistency. The bigger question is whether knowing Warren didn't have Katie's number that night changes how you interpret the timing, or whether the sequence still feels backwards.
That seems to be what happened. But no, there was this young lady was not part of their friend group. That's right.
Okay, so when they say they didn't know her, but yet they were texting her, they did know her name.
Well, I don't know if I agree with that characterization. Yeah, the
Well,
premise,
enlighten me.
the
I want to
premise is
know.
flawed. Yeah, the premise is flawed. She's not part of their friend group. They don't know her. I can tell you that it does appear, once again, it appears that Nolan was with this young lady for much of the day. That does seem to be confirmed by many witnesses.
From here forward, the focus narrows specifically to the attorney's own statements, not commentators, not friends, but the actual lawyers representing this friend group on air. When their own answers don't line up, those inconsistencies deserve closer scrutiny, especially because these are the people whose job is to communicate precise information. The clearest example happens in real time during an on-air discussion. Attorney Edward Paltzik states plainly that his clients did not know Katie. But Tyler Cox, who represents the same clients, gives a much more detailed account. According to Cox, his clients spent that night texting everyone they knew while trying to locate Nolan. Eventually, they obtained Katie's number through mutual friends and contacted her directly by text or Snapchat, receiving a response from her that same night. Nancy Grace immediately caught the apparent contradiction and asked the obvious question. If they didn't know Katie, how did they know who to contact? Paltzik responded by arguing the premise of the question was flawed, rather than directly addressing the apparent discrepancy. And that matters, because these statements describe two different levels of connection. It's entirely possible to have never personally met someone while still knowing who they are through a shared social circle. Someone can be 1 degree removed without having a personal relationship with that person. So, technically, saying we didn't know her could mean the group had never personally met Katie. But when an attorney is asked to explain how his clients were able to identify and contact her that same night, simply rejecting the premise instead of clarifying the connection doesn't offer much clarity. It can make a reasonable question look like it's being avoided, whether or not there was actually anything improper behind it. It's also worth examining the mechanics of the sequence Tyler Cox described. His explanation wasn't simply that the group vaguely asked around and eventually someone happened to know a person named Katie. He described a specific chain of events. His clients contacted people they knew, worked outward through their social network, reached mutual friends who could connect them with Katie, and eventually got a direct way to reach her. They then received an actual response from her that same night, one detailed enough for Cox to characterize what she told them. That level of speed and specificity raises a reasonable question when placed next to the absolute statement that they didn't know Katie. Again, it's possible "did not know" was being used in a narrower sense, meaning they had never personally met her, rather than having no awareness of her at all. But the distinction matters. The second inconsistency involves the attorneys and another source who had repeatedly spoken about the friend group. Officer Tatum stated during the same broadcast that, based on his understanding, all but one of the friends had taken a polygraph equivalent test and passed, reportedly without lawyers present. Attorney Tyler Cox, representing those same clients, stated directly that his clients had not taken a polygraph test. That's not simply a minor difference in wording. Tatum's statement describes something that, based on his understanding, actually happened: formal testing, cooperation, and passing results. Cox's statement describes something entirely different, something he says never happened with his clients. At least one of those accounts appears to be incorrect. And because Tatum had personally interviewed members of the friend group repeatedly and at length, it's reasonable to ask why his understanding differs so significantly from the statement made by their own legal counsel. There is, however, an important clarification. Cox explained that a different young man, who wasn't one of his direct clients, along with Katie, had taken a voice stress analysis test. That's a different methodology from a traditional polygraph, and it could potentially explain some of the confusion. But it doesn't fully resolve Tatum's more specific claim that all but one of the group he interviewed had taken and passed something equivalent to a polygraph. That distinction matters because a polygraph and a voice stress analysis aren't simply two names for the same procedure. They involve different technologies and different underlying methods. So, if Tatum came away from his conversations with the group believing multiple people had passed an actual polygraph equivalent examination, while the group's own attorney says that never happened for his clients, there's clearly a communication gap somewhere. Perhaps Tatum was given inaccurate information. Perhaps he misunderstood what he was told. Or perhaps the attorney is making a technical distinction that wasn't being made as carefully in earlier conversations. All three explanations are possible, but none of them makes the communication around this particular claim look especially consistent. There's also a third, smaller inconsistency involving the boat. Pultzik describes the boat as something his clients have no ownership stake in. He emphasizes that none of them actually own the boat, particularly when questions arise about whether it's been searched or examined. Yet throughout the broader discussion, the boat is repeatedly described in practical terms as their boat and their emergency. The conversation refers to their mechanical problem, their emergency situation, their Coast Guard call, their trim controls, and their bilge pump. The ownership distinction becomes particularly important when the discussion turns toward questions about searching the boat. That doesn't necessarily mean the attorney's statement is factually false. It may simply mean ownership is being defined narrowly. But the timing of the distinction is what makes it worth noticing. Instead of directly addressing the underlying question, the ownership issue can redirect attention toward the actual owner of the boat. On its own, that might seem like a small technical distinction, but it resembles the same pattern seen in the other two examples. A technically defensible distinction being emphasized at precisely the moment it becomes useful in sidestepping a more difficult question. It's important, however, to be fair about what these examples do and don't prove. None of these inconsistencies prove anyone did anything to Nolan. Attorneys can misspeak. They can have incomplete information. They can describe a client's relationship with someone differently depending on how narrowly they interpret a question. It's also possible for an attorney to have different information than a commentator who spent more informal time speaking with members of the friend group. All of those explanations are possible, and none automatically requires bad faith. But these aren't completely insignificant details either. The Katie contradiction touches one of the most contested issues in the case: how well the people involved actually knew her, and what that might mean for the reliability of information about Nolan's final hours. The polygraph contradiction also matters because claims about testing have repeatedly been used publicly to argue for the friend group's credibility. When the attorneys themselves appear unable to maintain consistent explanations about these points during a broadcast where they're trying to establish credibility with a national audience, that can naturally affect how viewers judge the overall account. And there's a broader pattern across all three examples. Each one begins with a very clear, absolute statement. They did not know Katie. My clients have not taken a polygraph. None of them own the boat. But each statement can potentially get more complicated once the surrounding details are examined. That doesn't necessarily mean the statements were outright lies. It also doesn't necessarily mean they were innocent mistakes. Another possibility is that the statements were technically accurate only under a narrower interpretation than the average viewer would naturally assume. That's a specific kind of imprecision. It's the difference between giving the cleanest possible version of a fact and giving the most complete and carefully qualified version of it. And that distinction matters when credibility is at the center of the discussion. A defense attorney is trained to choose words carefully and avoid unnecessary admissions or overstatements. But a skeptical audience is also trained to notice when a simple answer appears to get technically narrower only after difficult questions are raised. The verdict here is straightforward. These three moments represent genuine on-air inconsistencies in the attorney's own statements. They aren't necessarily proof of wrongdoing, and they don't establish what happened to Nolan. But taken together, they raise a legitimate question about how consistently and transparently certain details have been communicated. The Katie explanation, the disagreement over the polygraph claim, and the boat ownership distinction each involve statements that get more complicated once the surrounding context is examined. And ultimately, the issue isn't whether one isolated sentence proves anything. It's whether repeated technical distinctions at key moments make the overall account harder to trust. So, which of these three concerns you the most? The Katie contradiction? The conflicting polygraph claims? Or the boat ownership distinction?
How are they going to get it if they don't give it to them?
Warrant? Subpoena Dukas
Based on
taken? Grand
what?
jury subpoena Dukas taken?
Sure, but it hasn't been to the
No
grand
one's
jury
found?
yet. Hasn't been to the grand jury
There
yet.
is. Are you telling me you don't think a grand jury is convening on this?
I think they are. I don't think they have looked at
Well,
the
you said,
case
how do you
yet.
get the phone? You obviously get the phone. Police go say, hey, can we look at the phone? And they go, sure, here it is. That's one way.
Well,
Or you're
what if they don't give it to
investigating a
them?
potential crime. You get a warrant and you go, hey, give me the phone. Here's the warrant. That's two ways. Or you get a grand jury or a judge's order. There's all sorts of ways to get that phone.
Well, Nancy,
You could
Nancy,
just ask and they hand it over.
Yeah, Nancy,
Why didn't they give it to
why
him?
has the? Yeah, Nancy, why? Yeah, why is that phone hasn't been turned over? Why? Why?
I guess
would
it
the
hasn't
DA's
been
office
asked
need to
for,
get a warrant?
But I think it should be, and I think it should be asked for. Look, I am not stirring the Nolan Wells phone pot with you. I got bigger fish to fry with you two gentlemen. I'm just curious. I mean, wouldn't that put a lot to bed if we could look at the phone and look at the GPS tracker on it, look at the route? I mean, look,
Yeah,
I know
we
where my
want more
twins are
evidence.
right now because they got Live 360. Yay.
Nancy,
Why can't we
want
look
more,
at that? I mean,
Nancy, we want more evidence. Let's get it all. That's the thing. That's the beauty of it. When you're telling the truth and you're representing three innocent young men, the beauty of it is you want more evidence.
We gave our phones up. We let them do a
Yeah.
phone dump of our phones.
which I find very, very interesting. Because a phone dump, everybody shows where the phone's been, what time it was there. It's not hard to do. It pings off phone cell towers, and you can tell as it progresses along. Not hard. Easy. And I find that probative because it will tell me when the boys went to Horn Island, the young men, and when they returned. It's better than an eyewitness to me.
This is where the interview becomes especially sharp. Nancy Grace stops accepting general reassurances and asks the one direct, checkable question underneath all of them. Not, we're working on it. Not, there's a process underway. A simple question with a simple answer, More than 30 days after Nolan's death, his phone, the single most direct piece of digital evidence related to his final hours, still had not been turned over to investigators. The attorneys referenced a letter sent by Ben Crump's team the night before, specifically because the phone had still not been handed over. That is not a minor procedural detail. It may be one of the most consequential unresolved issues raised during the entire broadcast. But determining who that delay actually reflects on is more complicated than simply blaming one side. So let's trace what is known about the phone. According to the friend group's own account, Nolan's phone was left on the boat. Warren's group reportedly retrieved it, and Christine later recovered the phone herself after using Life 360 to track it down. If that account is accurate, then physical custody of the phone shifted relatively early in the case from the friend group to Nolan's family. That changes the central question. Instead of simply asking why Warren, Morgan, or Jax did not turn the phone over, the question becomes, who actually has the phone now, and why has it still not reached investigators? If the family recovered the phone weeks ago because they wanted answers, and if they have been publicly demanding transparency and accountability from others involved in the case, then it is fair to ask why that same piece of evidence has not yet reached investigators more than a month later. That is not a rhetorical attack. It is the same standard of scrutiny that should be applied consistently to everyone involved. And there are understandable reasons why the delay on the family's side might not have anything sinister behind it. A grieving family dealing with the immediate loss of a child may not have prioritized the formal process of submitting a phone into an evidence chain the moment they received it. Grief does not move at the same speed as a forensic investigation, and it would be unreasonable to expect a grieving parent to behave like a trained evidence technician. There is also the possibility that the family's legal team wanted independent forensic access first or was dealing with legitimate questions about how the device should be transferred without compromising its contents. Those are both human and defensible explanations. But there is another detail worth considering. Christine has publicly described looking through the phone herself, including checking Snapchat for content she believed should have been there. That means the family did not simply recover the phone and leave it untouched. They had already examined it themselves before any formal forensic handoff. Again, that is understandable. It is difficult to imagine a grieving parent simply waiting for a formal chain of custody procedure before looking at their own child's phone when they are desperate for answers. But it does create another legitimate question. Why did the personal examination happen before the formal forensic examination? A defense attorney representing the friend group could reasonably raise that issue if the case ever reached a courtroom. Now consider the timeline. Saying that the phone hasn't been turned over sounds less significant without understanding how long the delay has lasted. By the time of this broadcast, more than 30 days had passed since Nolan's death. Nancy Grace referenced that time frame multiple times during the interview. That means an entire month had passed while one of the most direct pieces of digital evidence concerning Nolan's final hours remained outside investigators' hands. At the same time, both sides were publicly emphasizing transparency in their own ways. A month is certainly long enough for legal, emotional, or procedural complications to explain a delay. But it is also long enough that the public is justified in wanting a clear explanation. And this is where the question turns back toward the attorneys. Their own language makes the issue harder to dismiss as a simple oversight. Attorney Pulse does not merely describe his clients as cooperative. He presents the desire for more evidence as a broader principle. The message is essentially that everything should be examined and brought into the open because the truth ultimately helps an innocent person. If that is a sincere position rather than simply a talking point, then another fair question follows. Why have those same attorneys not publicly pushed with the same urgency for Nolan's own phone to reach investigators? It does not matter which side currently possesses the phone. If the position is, we want everything out there, then remaining silent about one of the most significant missing pieces creates a noticeable gap between the size of the statement and the effort being publicly demonstrated behind it. When Nancy Grace presses the attorneys about the actual mechanics of getting the phone released, whether through a warrant, subpoena, or grand jury order, the response shifts toward a different argument. Why is that our responsibility? Legally, that may be a completely accurate position. But rhetorically, it represents a noticeable retreat from the broader, let's get everything out there message presented only moments earlier. That change is worth noticing. When the conversation is focused on his own client's cooperation, the framing is expansive. Full transparency. Nothing to hide. Everything should be examined. Those are strong and admirable standards to present publicly. But once the same standard is applied to evidence outside his control, the answer becomes narrower. That is not really a question for me. Both positions can individually be defended. The inconsistency appears when they are placed side by side, only minutes apart, during the same interview. So here is the verdict. This is not a clean, one-sided contradiction. It is a fair question that lands on both sides of the case. The friend group's attorneys have made a broad argument in favor of full evidentiary transparency, but there has been no visible effort from them to publicly demand that Nolan's phone reach investigators. At the same time, according to the friend group's own account, Nolan's family physically recovered that phone weeks earlier and has already examined it themselves. Yet the phone still had not reached investigators by the time of the broadcast. That matters because the family has also been one of the strongest voices publicly demanding accountability and transparency from everyone else involved. There are understandable human explanations for the family's side of the delay. Grief, legal strategy, caution, and concerns about preserving evidence could all play a role. On the attorney's side, it is possible that the broader transparency message simply went further than the actual advocacy surrounding this particular piece of evidence. Both explanations are plausible, but neither side should automatically receive a complete pass simply because there is a sympathetic reason for the delay. The central question remains the same. Who should bear more responsibility for the fact that Nolan's phone still had not reached investigators? The family, while dealing with grief and possible legal strategy, or the attorneys, whose public message has emphasized complete transparency and the importance of getting all the evidence examined?